everybody. Welcome to the Washington Times. I'm Martin Di Caro, the host of History as It Happens podcast. And today we're talking about the Iraq War 20 years on. March 20th, 2003, President George W. Bush announced U.S. forces would invade Iraq to get rid of Saddam Hussein and his weapons of mass destruction, which we now know did not exist. And we're joined by Jeffrey Engel, historian and founding director of the Center for Presidential History at Southern Methodist University. Hello, Professor Engel.
Martin, it's always great to talk to you.
Or as I usually call you, Jeffrey, since you're a regular on the podcast.
That's my preference.
That's right. Jeff, you said the invasion of Iraq was the greatest mistake in the history of U.S. foreign policy. Why is that?
I think it was the greatest single strategic blunder for two reasons. First, because it did not turn out well, which is to say that if there's two ways really to evaluate a strategic decision: how you had the information going in and how you process that information and made your decision. And then the second, of course, are the consequences. And the consequences of this decision were terrible. And obviously it cost trillions of dollars, hundreds of thousands of lives on the Iraqi and American side, mostly Iraqi, of course, and really destabilized the region and eroded a lot of trust with America and its allies, and really destroyed whatever goodwill that we had remaining from 9/11 in the global community for the war on terror. So I think as a fundamental analysis of problems not being solved, this did not work out well for the United States. To more pressingly, let me go back to the beginning, which is to say that this also was a problem that appeared to be problematic going in, which is to say it was based upon faulty data. It was based upon more than that, based upon a lot of series of logical premises that frankly were historically ahistorical and illogical, most of which, most specifically, the idea that the United States could essentially have regime change lead to democracy, which would spread throughout the entire Middle East. That had never been tried before in human history. And of course, we saw the disastrous results. So I think it was bad decision-making and bad results for the United States.
Yeah, the consequences of the war reordered the Middle East, but not in the way that the Bush freedom agenda fantasized it would. The freedom agenda came a little bit after the fact, though. Melvin Leffler, a historian you're familiar with, who I just recently interviewed, discussed the origins of the Iraq War in his latest book, Confronting Saddam Hussein. He said there wasn't missionary zeal there in 2002, 2003. The Bush administration was primarily concerned with avoiding another terrorist attack on this country. They focused on Saddam because they believed his weapons of mass destruction might wind up in the hands of terrorists. Why did the war fail so badly? I mean, my view is that it could only produce disaster, sending our armies into the Middle East like that. But why, in your view, did the war fail so catastrophically?
You know, honestly, this is something I've been wondering about for 20 odd years. And I don't mean to sound like a Monday morning quarterback on this, but I remember being with in my postdoctoral years at Yale during this time and sitting with friends who are also students and saying, why does everybody who appears to be in charge think this could possibly work? Which is to say, a massive military occupation in the Middle East, in the middle of a contentious period in Western, Middle Eastern relations, shall we say, after the war on terror. Also, more importantly, a war which the United States was trying to wage on the cheap. That is to say, Donald Rumsfeld's Pentagon tried as hard as possible to do as little as possible with as few troops as possible, or I should say as much as possible with as few troops as possible. They tried to essentially They tried to take the military analysis that was from Afghanistan. By the way, we know how Afghanistan turned out 20 years later as well. The military analysis of the first months of the war in Afghanistan, which suggested that American military superiority, technological superiority, would essentially be a force multiplier for the United States. And that is fine for the kinetic phase of the war. But I think they did not put any time or effort into planning what happens when the fighting in theory stops. The occupation phase is, I think, where the United States really blundered its strategic thinking. We did not plan beyond what would happen when Saddam Hussein was removed from power. We obviously had the strength to do that at minimal expenditure from an American perspective. It's the aftermath, the everyday, the nation building that President Bush himself had decried during his campaign in 2000. That proved to be the more difficult part.
And the insurgency erupted several months into the military occupation, lasted for several years, and claimed hundreds of thousands of lives, displaced millions of people. But for the United States, what are the consequences of the war today? Because we're talking about this on the anniversary, not just to rehash old bad news, but to figure out why this still matters. And what's your view on that?
Honestly, I don't think that you can understand American politics today without reference to two things: the Iraq War and the financial crisis of 2008. That is to say, the Bush years laid the foundation for all the animosity that we have today. Think about the critique of Donald Trump of the system, and by the way, the critique of Bernie Sanders of the system. So two people from politically opposite spheres who both agree that the United States spent too much money, did not invest in its own people and its own infrastructure, lost lives, and lost trust because of foreign engagements, foreign occupations that rarely, if ever, have worked in history, and certainly have not in American history. So I think that the reason to really think about the Iraq War, in addition to the devastation that it caused in the Middle East that still has reverberations today, is because those reverberations continue to rock American politics as well. I would contend, and this is the ultimate counterfactual, I don't think that you get a Donald Trump candidacy or a Bernie Sanders candidacy without the disillusionment of both the financial crisis and the failed mission in Iraq.
Yeah, trust in institutions destroyed by those failings.
Exactly.
Lastly, Jeff, President George W. Bush, he embraced a simplistic worldview. You're with us or against us. You're with us or with the terrorists, is what he actually said. The axis of evil. In his mind, everyone wanted to live in a free society, so why wouldn't they want what the United States had to offer when our forces invaded Iraq? But, to make a parallel to what's going on today, I hear a lot of this simplistic rhetoric in President Biden's talk about what's going on in Ukraine, one of cosmic importance between democracy and autocracy. So maybe we really haven't reckoned with the consequences of the Iraq War the way we should have.
Well, I think I might actually push back on that a little bit to say that one of the things that's fascinating about George W. Bush is he actually believed much the same as many American presidents. His father, Bill Clinton, Ronald Reagan, the idea that people around the world wanted to be free, that people naturally wanted to live in democracies and have an open society, that is an essential idea for American foreign policy, frankly, throughout the entire 20th century, or certainly past the Cold War. However, what made George W. Bush different was his notion that he could catalyze the process. Other presidents, George H.W. Bush is a great example, believed people around the world wanted democracy, and that was the wave of the future. So let it happen. Let people choose themselves to turn towards democracy, and we should enable them and support them when possible, but not force their hands. And George W. Bush, after 9/11, I would argue, believed there was no time to waste, that essentially the world was too dangerous to wait for that natural process to evolve. So going back to Ukraine then, I actually think George W. Bush's policy is out of line with with American policy for Ukraine today, because American policy for Ukraine today is not about expanding freedom. It's about preserving freedom. Now, we can argue about that word freedom, which means whatever it wants to, whoever wants to use it at any time. But at the very least, I think the difference would be if the Biden administration was trying to roll back Putin's influence into Russia, into other areas, trying to advance American influence. I think preserving where America's allies are, Ukraine being one of them, is different from what George W. Bush tried to do, which was to promote and enlarge America's sphere of influence.
You would agree that it's still about the U.S. having a say in the shape of the world order. This is about extending U.S. influence, if not hegemony.
Yes, but I mean, you and I have had this argument before, in a friendly way. I would redefine the terms a little bit. I don't think it's necessarily about extending American hegemony. I think it's about the United States taking on the role, and we can debate whether this is good or not, but taking on the role of international cop, essentially international arbiter of the rules of the road, which frankly is something that we've done since 1945. And I think the general trend of prosperity and stability in the world since 1945, huge mistakes like Iraq and Vietnam notwithstanding, the general trend has been positive under American leadership. So I think the most important thing the United States is doing at this point is essentially saying there are rules to the international system. One of those rules is don't invade your neighbors. We saw that rule played out in 1991. We're seeing that rule, I think, played out in 2022, 23 in Ukraine. So I don't think it's about American hegemony. I think it's about America being a promoter of stability. Now, whether that's worth our investment, that's a different conversation. But I don't think it's about hegemony. I think it's about stability.
Debate is underway. Jeffrey Engel at Southern Methodist University. Thank you. I'm Martin Di Caro. History as it happens is available at WashingtonTimes.com and wherever you get your podcasts.